what you know. It's, a lot of times in comics, it's about who you know. And that's where a large part of my career has started and has kept me going. Then Pokemon blew up. It was a mass phenomenon, kids passing out, everyone going crazy, you know, videotapes flying off the shelves. And, you know, Marvel at that point wanted to get into the manga and anime game. So Joe and Jimmy said, oh, we know this crazy manga guy who loves Marvel. So I came in, I met with Ralph Macchio and Brian Smith at that point. Tom Brevoort was around as well, and we concocted the idea for the Marvel Mangaverse. It came out of, Brian Smith was the one, great editor, Smitty we called him, had all these fantastic ideas, worked with him on some stuff, we got a bunch of creators involved. Originally it was supposed to be what if Japanese creators reimagined the Marvel Universe, but we found out that was much too expensive and much too time consuming given deadlines, so we went with a lot of the guys who were coming up with manga styles again, you know, like Kari Andrews came in and did Legend of the Spider Clan.
Yeah!
All right, good, thank you. And I was at that point I was like torn between, I didn't really want to be an editor, I want to be a writer, so I started writing a couple things. I wrote the X-Men series, the Mangaverse stuff.
You wrote Loners. Loners was pretty good.
Yeah, that was later. So I've always walked the line between kind of writing and being an editor. And then when I started introducing more manga artists into the Marvel system, just through editors, Bill Jemis at the time and Joe said, hey, why don't you come on and be an editor? So I came on as an editor. Long story short, it turns out I was a really bad editor. I always gave the writers and the artists the benefit of the doubt. Oh, you'll have it Friday? Sure, I believe you. Yeah, no problem.
Your scanner broke again?
Oh, man, wow. And I had a very bad track record. All my books were late, but they look great. So I admitted through, you know, a couple people pushed me to admit that I'm not the greatest editor, but all the talent liked me, so I moved into talent management. And that's what I do kind of now is, you know, find and bring in and manage the careers of writers. And mostly artists, though, is what I do through Marvel. And I've been doing that for, geez, about 5 or 6 years now. So it's always just gratifying to come to shows like this, meet the fans, talk about breaking in, review portfolios, and find someone who have eventually run into Marvel and the editors have responded to, have gone on to successful careers, putting out, you know, great books for us. So it's kind of what I got into. Want to talk quick about how you broke into comics?
Sure. I started off like a lot of other artists did. I started going to conventions. Started off at the convention at a local one in Atlanta called Dragon Con, where at the time Marvel and DC still were setting up with the show. I did that for years. I would show my work around, just trying to get advice from anybody that would be willing to look at it.
Did you go to art school?
I went to art school for 9 months. Until my professor, I got tired of him telling me that comic art was crap, so I dropped out. I'll show you, I'll go work at Red Lobster. Yeah, I just kept going to conventions, just drawing in my free time, and eventually I met someone named Sanford Green, who's done a lot of work for DC and Dark Horse. And at the time he was working for a really super small local comic company called Vineyard Press. And he introduced me to the guy running Vineyard Press, and he gave me a little backup story in a comic. I did a couple little things for them. So the important thing there was that I had something printed, that's the most important thing. Even if you have to pay to have it done, it's the most important thing. I did the work for free, because at the time I just wanted to do something. I took that to around to conventions, and I met Rick Ketchum, who at the time was the inker of Randy Green. And Rick liked the story, so he took it to Randy, and Randy took it to someone he was working with at the time, Darren Davis, who was the editor, or I guess the owner of Tidal Wave Studios at the time, an Image imprint. And they were working on The 10th Muse, and they were doing a backup story with a character called Atlas, and he asked if I wanted to create the character. So I did a 3-part backup story in 10th Muse, and then eventually did my own, you know, like a #1 of that book, which I think maybe sold 1,000 copies. About that time, Darren Davis wasn't doing so hot, and eventually he broke off and went to Avatar, and I think at that point I kind of broke it off as well because I was having payment issues, which I think is nothing new. But at least I had more stuff printed, and that was the important thing. So I took that to Chicago a few years back, probably going on 9 years ago, And at the time, that was right when Pat Lee and Dreamwave and Devil's Due were just blowing up. It was at Chicago. It was that was I think a month after Transformers #1 came out. That sold like 500,000 copies or something, and so they were huge. So I went over to Dreamwave and I asked for Pat Lee, and they said he'd be back in a few minutes. So I just stood there and waited, and eventually he showed up. And showed him my work. I did the same thing over at Devil's Due with Josh Blaylock at the time, who ran Devil's Due, and showed him my work. And simultaneously that show, I got work for both companies, doing Transformers and G.I. Joe. So again, it was just source book stuff, some basic stuff, but still, again, I was getting stuff printed. From there, I had a lot of again issues with Pat Lee, and so I ended up. Yeah. So I was kind of breaking ties with Dreamwave a bit, and around that time I was looking online, reading comic interviews, and I was reading an interview with a guy named Eric Coe, who runs Udon. And he was talking about the state of the industry and art in the industry, and he happened to mention myself and Scotty Young in the interview, saying that, these guys are the new guys that are coming up. And I was really flattered, so I found his email, and I emailed him to say thank you. And he emailed back and said, no problem, do you want to talk? And he gave me his number, and I ended up calling him, and I came to find out that he had been fired by Dreamwave a few months before that, and there were some other artists that ended up leaving Dreamwave, and they decided, because they wanted to keep working, they would all form a group, and that's where Udon formed from.
It's like a bad supervillain origin.
It really is. Only it was them leaving the League of Evil and forming the JLA. So he asked me if I wanted to join Udon, and so I did, and ended up doing some work with him on Robotech and Capcom and things like that. And about that time, I started going to conventions. I went to one in Philly, and at that time, Udon was working with Marvel, doing a lot of stuff like Deadpool, and some different cover work, different projects. And he introduced me to Jameis, who was the publisher at the time. And Jameis liked my stuff, and he gave me a trial script for a Spider-Man book, which was a rewrite of Stan Lee's original Amazing Fantasy #15. And I think at the time I was told it was a spec script, a sample script, basically, to see how I would do. I would still get paid and all that, but it was, not sure if it was going to see publication, but it was just, let's see how you do kind of thing. So I did it. I called in a digital painter friend of mine, Danimation. He digitally painted the entire thing. I turned it in, and Marvel liked it, and I went on. They assigned me to Cable Deadpool. I got into the second issue when I was told that apparently Marvel Age had been picked up. They were going to start kicking off the Marvel Age Spider-Man line. They needed 3 more issues. Started doing that. Finished Cable Deadpool. Was told I was launching a new character called Aranya. I did the first couple of issues of Aranya, and I was talking to my editor one day, and I just said, hey, can I get a contract at Marvel? Not realizing how naive of a question that is, but she took it to the higher ups. I got my contract, and I've been there ever since. That's how it happened.
So there you have the different opinions from writer to artist, talent scout, editor-in-chief, and director of communications. So it's 5 completely different jobs in the comic industry and 5 different stories you see, but kind of a love of comics and art is what connects everything. So we have some time now. What I usually do is you guys came here for a reason. And you've heard how we broke in, and you've gotten a little bit of advice, but you might have specific questions on about yourself, about writers, artists, what you can do more to break in. And we're here to give you the advice that we hope you might need. We hope. So if you want to come up, raise your hands. If someone wants to take one of the mics, right? Is it quiet enough? You can probably just shout, right?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi. For writing, do you prefer novels or short stories or like stuff on like blogs or like what type of writing material do you need to have published?
So for submitting samples, what do we prefer for writers to submit? Okay.
To be blunt, I think that the best way we can review your art is if you create sequential art. You create a comic book, an ashcan or web comic book or something that we can look at and read.
Okay.
In the hierarchy of things that an editor can get to, it's easier for us to look at that and make a spot judgment on it quickly. If we like what we start reading, we keep reading. That's not to say that if you write the next great American novel, that's not going to catch your eye. But understand that writing a novel, writing prose is different than writing comics. It's a very different endeavor. It's easier to